Hey everybody, welcome back to Andertons TV. We've got an episode of Meet the Maker today, and our maker in the house is Jesse Honig. He's flown in today, or flown into the UK this week, and Jesse is the guy behind 29 pedals.
Yeah.
Now, before we start talking about the pedals, welcome to Andertons.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful here.
Tell us a little bit about, you started 29 pedals within the last 4 or 5 years, right?
Yeah. The EUNA came out about four or 5 years ago now. Yeah, I was working for some other gear brands and working as a repair tech and working in studios and things. And at one point I just started to build a device because I wanted it, and then very quickly realized that I knew how to produce more of them because of working for other brands. And I made maybe 10 or 15 of them and handed them out to some of my friends and colleagues who are really serious tone nerds. And they loved it. Well, I gave 15 of them out, and 14 people loved it. And one guy who I really trust, he was like, there's something about this one that's weird. And so I got it back from him, and I realized there was one component that was different, just a different different type of capacitor. I had run out of film caps when I was building them because I just had parts laying around the bench. And so I put a ceramic in there, and it's one of the things that really cemented in my brain that components really matter, you know, because then I swapped it out for the film cap I had put in all the other ones, and then the 15th person loved it. And then I knew I had something that I wanted to make more of. Started just hanging out in studios when I was as young as I could, you know, maybe 13, 14 is when I got my first job in a studio. And then that's basically all I did for a long time. When I moved to LA, I started doing live work again because I got an opportunity to work at a really amazing venue there. And that ended up introducing me to some people I went on tour with as a front of house engineer. And then I kind of went back to being a studio engineer, and I worked as a tech in a few large studios. And it's basically all I did until I started building gear, you know, as engineering. Move microphones around is just all I just move microphones around all day.
Well, that's great. And to be honest, I think what a perfect background into, you know, making pedals, particularly the kind of pedals that you make, which I think are more in that sort of solution element rather than, you know, effects pedals as such. Now, when we demo a lot of pedals in Andertons, as you guys know. You watch a lot of Andertons videos of us demoing pedals. And typically when you buy a pedal, it'll have some knobs on it, and they'll tell you what the knobs do, and it's, you know, and you're in familiar territory.
Yeah.
I have to be honest with you, when I first saw the 29 pedals, I was just like, whoa, what is this? There's a couple of them have little knobs on them, but a lot of them just have these dip switches on them.
Yeah.
So tell me, the EUNA was the first one you designed.
Yeah.
The EUNA was the one, I mean, I think, you know, congratulations, you got the best slice of, you know, sort of, you know, startup promotion ever, when all of a sudden, you know, John Mayer ends up posting a picture with an EUNA on his board. It's like every new pedal maker's dream, isn't it?
Yeah, there's an army of people on Instagram who follow his gear, and so I started getting, for a few months prior, I knew he had one, but I don't like to mention that. This comes from also being a studio engineer. Like, you don't give up the tapes on somebody unless they do it. So I usually don't say that somebody has one unless they've posted a picture of it. So I was getting these Bigfoot photos from pedal nerds for months ahead of time, being like, does John have one or does John not have one? And I was like, well, I don't know. You know,
so what's this? What are you trying to solve? And I think that's the nub of it, isn't it? You know, it's like, it's not a chorus pedal, it's not an echo pedal, it's almost not, you know, it's not a drive pedal conventionally.
Yeah.
So what are you trying to solve with the EUNA?
You're right to refer to it as like a solutions-based kind of pedal. From my work in studios and live, I came to the conclusion that tons of problems that you have can be solved really quickly by having a good impedance converter at the front of your board. And a lot of players would do that with a simple buffer or with like the buffer built into your tuner. We'll do it to a certain extent. And for some people, that's sufficient and that's great. I'm not mad at that at all. The people I was working for, a lot of them were just really serious tone nerds. And I was constantly saying, like, we're in a studio right now, and sometimes the guitar player likes to cut from the control room so you can talk, but the amps are out here, so you got to run cable through the wall. And as soon as you're running any length of cable, it all of a sudden sounds crummy. Having a little line driver, a little impedance converter on the floor can really, really solve a lot of problems. The people I was working with wouldn't use them because they tend not to be great sounding circuits. I think this is a fair criticism of a sort of conventional buffer design. Is it solves a problem, it does the job it sets out to do really well, but rarely do they sound good, rarely are they inspiring. Sometimes the headroom and the noise leave a little to be desired for a person like me who's just very fussy. So I wanted to apply what I knew about old consoles. Like, I spent a lot of time in my life restoring old Neves, and I don't know if you've ever seen the inside of them, but they are gorgeous. They are really well made, and there's a lot of detail paid to things that aren't necessarily of critical importance, but are of minor importance, and cumulatively, it ends up making a big impact. Why are these old Neves still the best sounding consoles? You look inside, and all the metalwork is really nice. It's really well shielded. The traces are short where it matters, and individually, you might be able to change one of those things, and it wouldn't sound terrible. But if you agree to make all these small improvements, you'll find that you have a device that, especially for a player that is sensitive to it, does sound better and does feel better. So a lot of people that end up using EUNA are people who maybe would have liked to have a conventional buffer for the problem solving, but turned it on and felt that it was kind of flat sounding or slow sounding. So I just set out to apply what I knew about consoles to a pedal. So it's got a really robust internal power supply that presents plus minus 15 rails to the circuit. So it's running on 30 volts. It'll run at a little higher current than a lot of other methods that pedal builders use to put in voltage doublers and things like that. And I made it so that in a pinch, you can basically plug anything into the input. The input says whatever, because you can plug in 7.5 to 35 volts of AC or DC in either polarity, and nothing changes. The pedal doesn't care. The sound of the circuit doesn't change. It doesn't increase or decrease the headroom. It's so that, like, if you're on a stage and your power supply blows up and you have something that looks like it fits, you can be in, like, you're overseas, right? And you're like, what do I do? Just plug anything into it. It'll be fine.
It'll probably be fine.
It'll be fine.
Let's hear it. You guys out there might be forgiven for you might be a bit more familiar to see it in this color. This is a color that Jesse's made just for Andertons, basically. But it's the same inside, right?
Yeah.
So there we go. Let's hear it. We've got a couple of amps. We've got one very clean, high headroom, sort of 100 watt clean amp, which is the Victory V140. And then we've got a slightly more sort of edge of breakup, lower output 20 watt Friedman little sister. We are running about maybe between 30 to 40 feet of cable. We're using an AB box. So, we're not necessarily using the length of cable or rig that you might have if you were on a big stage or in a studio in a control room. But it's enough cable, I think, to hear what it's trying to do, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, to me, it is. Yeah.
So here's without. It's that classic, when you hear a good buffer and you just go, oh, wow. I had no idea that even a relatively modest amount of cable is going to, affect my, is going to affect my tone so much.
Yeah. And a lot of times people describe it as a feel thing, which I know is like, it's hard to describe unless you stand there and you have the feeling. Mm-hmm. But, these little magnets in here, you're creating this little bit of magnetic flux, and it's pushing electrons all the way down these wires. And while it takes a very small amount of time. It does take an amount of time to do it. And if you apply a little bit of power to it, you can make that flow a lot easier. So especially like you can hear already I'm like a quiet kind of player. You can immediately feel the difference that it feels easier to push out to the amp, and it feels like you're connected to the amp again with a short cable, which is like, you know, if you just like the sound of your guitar and the sound of your amp, you can just sit next to it with a short cable and it'll be great.
Let's see what difference we haven't engaged any of these switches yet either. We'll talk about those in a second. We'll talk about why it has an effects loop on the back of it too, and then we'll talk about some of the other 29 pedals. But here's the Friedman now. Let's take this off. It's for me, it's had a bigger difference, I think, when you've got some gain maybe applied to the circuit. I don't know, is there a technical reason why that might be? Or?
I don't know. I mean, I think it depends a lot on the way you play and what you're trying to get out of the guitar. Under my fingers, it always seems to make a big difference for me. But I have heard people, you know, for whom it'll have a bigger difference in one way or the other. I mean, a lot of times it's as you're adding gain, the frequency response of the amp is changing. So if there's something in that amp that's pushing something that you're losing, I think what we forget sometimes in the world of like signal transmission that maybe a different kind of engineer would be better able to explain is that once something is gone, you can't get it back without adding noise or distortion or some other thing. So if this pickup is having a hard time hitting that amp, and so the frequency response is rolling off a little bit, you can add treble back at the amp and get a similar frequency response, but you'll get noise. It might change the way the gain stages are. Where the tone control is in that circuit is after V1, so you're still hitting the first tube in a kind of dark way, whereas maybe hitting the first tube in a bright way and then rolling the tone off a little bit later is going to have a different response. So for people that like really like to sit and fine tune, I'm hitting this way, I'm hitting this that way, and that's creating exactly what I like, it ends up being really helpful to basically be able to, you know, growing up in studios also, like, you're standing in a studio with a guitar and you want to be able to hold the signal in your hand and plug it into whatever you want. Yeah. Is it a guitar amp? Is it a pedal? Is it a Pultec? And you want to know that the signal isn't being changed just because you plugged it in there. So all of us have had that experience. You try to plug into a line input on something and you realize the frequency response is gone. But having something like this around, you know, you can plug it into a Pultec and it doesn't care. So if you want to put a Pultec before your amplifier, you can now be free to do that without any problems.
So let's just run through the three switches, H, B, and L. I forget what they even stand for. So
harmonics, bright, and low.
So I guess bright and low are self-explanatory. What are you adding with harmonics?
Harmonics is basically adding a shelf up in the air band above all the fundamentals. So, you know, wherever the fundamental is of here, it's well above that. So you're bringing out all the little sparkly bits of the guitar, all the harmonics that are up there. You can also think about it like an air control. You know, it's a little similar to like preamps that have a little air control where it's just going up in the top end.
Let's see what happens as we mess around. We'll leave it on the clean amp, I think.
Yeah, like I like that for here. Yeah, it's something you really miss when it's gone, you know? And some of it is for creative use, just they're good sounding filters. Some of it is also built to like help you out in a pinch. Like let's say you're on a gig and you normally bring a Strat and a Tele, and one day there's some reason you can't bring the Strat or the Strat broke a string, and you're sitting here with your Tele which is a great sounding telly. And you need it to just be like closer to the Strat, you know? Like the classic, like. Whereas flat, still more like a telly. You know, you don't have the tremolo on it, but apart from that.
Look, that's cool, mate. Just very briefly then, just tell us why,
Yeah.
I mean, lots of people will perhaps know the answer to this already, but why would you put a send and return on the buffer pedal?
So what the send and return does is it fully removes EUNA from the circuit and it puts this normal path in there. So most people, like most viewers of this channel who watch a lot of your stuff, will know that with a lot of classic style fuzz circuits, there's a high degree of interaction between the guitar and the fuzz. And if you put a buffer of any kind in between that, it sort of truncates that interaction. If that interaction isn't what you're looking for, you know, you can skip past this part. But if that's really important to you, most people know that you'll plug it directly into the fuzz and then the fuzz will go into the buffer and then that'll go out to the rest of your chain. One of the things I found when I was researching it was that in addition to fuzzes having like low input impedance, which is what creates all the interactivity with the guitar's controls because they basically become part of the tone circuit of the pedal, fuzzes also tend to have higher than usual output impedance, which makes them interactive with your other pedals. So something with a mid to low input impedance, like a lot of really good sounding drive pedals, if you put a buffer in between the fuzz and the drive pedal, you're truncating that interaction. So a lot of people, right, it's not just that they like a fuzz face, it's that they like a fuzz face into a blues breaker. And what you find is that if you put something else in between there, the interaction between those is shunted. And I wanted to be able to maintain that. So if you don't need your clean path, it's also part of the idea is also how consoles work. You don't just layer things in and everything is in series. You put some things in parallel and you swap them in and out. So you can think about this as like a swap. So this is EUNA, and then when it's off, it's swapped to this pair so that you can have a fuzz pedal there and EUNA's completely out of the way. So you're not just always putting things in series.
Cool.
And I think it's if you do some experiments with it like on your own board, you'll see that like, yeah, that classic fuzz does the thing you like that it does because it's hitting your favorite drive pedal as well.
Yeah.
You know, and that creates a little, you know, basically like the low output impedance, high input impedance has very low interactivity. Higher output impedance like a guitar or a fuzz pedal, and low input impedance like a fuzz pedal or a drive pedal creates high degrees of interactivity. So when you're finding these pairings that you like, they can be very dependent on how they're arranged.
Cool. All right. Well, look. So that's the EUNA. The second pedal that you released was the OAMP.
Oh yeah,
wasn't
OAMP.
it?
Yeah.
Oh, you say it differently.
I say it WAMP, but a lot of people say it OAMP.
I wouldn't. Yes,
great.
I wouldn't know how to say OAMP, something like that. Anyway, give me a second to plug this in. WAMP, OAMP, you choose. What were you trying to solve with the WAMP?
So when I first finished the EUNA design, I actually had two of them on my board, one at the beginning and one at the end. A lot of people will be like familiar with the idea of a line driver at the output of your board, just so you can get out to the amp without any cable loss because it's a bit of cable. I basically started to notice that I wanted other things out of the EUNA that was on the back of the board than I wanted on the front. So I kind of just went back to the drawing board, started a new design, and started working on the concept of an output driver. When we think about, I guess we can call it like the traditional pedal board layout where you have your input driver and your drives and then your mod stuff is at the end. We love to talk about using a clean boost to hit the amp or driving a pedal hard to hit the amp hard. But when you're running through a bunch of pedals that are running on 9 volts, you may not have as much headroom as you think. So part of that sound may be crunching the buffer in your reverb pedal or the line amp of the reverb pedal. And now, again, if that's the sound you want and that's how you want to create it, I'm not mad at that. I think that's great. Like however you achieve the sound you want. But from an engineering perspective, working for artists, you want to know why something has been created and how you could recreate it if you needed. And you don't want to create distortion where the artist doesn't want distortion. So part of the idea of WAMP was being able to hit the amp hard with about 30 dB of gain without necessarily having to hit the rest of your pedal board hard. So the first thing that happens is it does similar things to EUNA, where it's got a little bit lower input impedance than EUNA. So if you use it in place of EUNA, it's a little warmer, you'll hear. But the output drive is even heavier, so it'll drive down to two 600 ohm loads and doesn't really care. You can then drive the amp hard without driving the pedal board hard. Also, it's got the gain set up in two different stages because the you know, gain stages, when you're designing them, the tonality of the stage depends a lot on the gain. So when you are designing a low gain stage, it sounds a little different than a high gain stage. So that's why I have these switches here. You'll see that each gain stage, this is the input stage and the output stage, has a low and a high setting, and they each have a cool filter attached to them. The low setting has a bright attached to it, and the high setting has a dark attached to it. Part of the reason for that to exist is just some creative choices. They're nice sounding filters. Also, if you're a person that backlines amps, you know, let's say I'm doing a fly date. I'm going to show up in another town, another place, and I asked for this deluxe, and they gave me a Hot Rod Deluxe. And both good sounding amps, but different responding, different feeling. So having a little bit of control on the back end of your board without necessarily having to redial in all your pedals that you know you like this drive sound, but it's not working with this amp. It's a little quick way to say, you know what, this amp is just a little bright, so I'm going to darken this up. This amp is just a little dark, so I'm going to brighten it. I like the way it sounds. And that brings in the presence control. The presence control is basically like a like a typical amp style mid scoop, like a Fender style mid scoop on a knob. So all the way up is gentle shaping, and as you pull it back, you get more of that sort of deluxe mid scoop. So let's say you have a little tweed champ that you kind of wish it had a little bit of that meh, but because I run into that problem all the time. Love a tweed champ with no tone control. It's like my favorite sounding amp, but I do want a little bit of that thing. So just having it on a knob to be able to get that response out of different amps can be really helpful and really fun.
Well, let's give it. I mean,
I'll set up
my brain has never even considered putting a pedal like this after. I would typically have a reverb pedal as my last pedal on my board.
Yeah,
and it makes a lot of sense to because I like to use boosts and stuff like that, and I'd never even really thought about the idea of maybe the reverb pedal not liking the fact that there's a boost going into it.
And you're hanging a bunch of cable off the end of it. The reverb pedal you like is probably a great sounding, probably your favorite sounding reverb pedal. Was it designed to drive a lot of cable, to hit different loads? How good is its headroom? Also, the tonality of the reverb is going to change a lot with headroom. So you're using your boosts on your right-hand side to shape how you like the reverb to respond. But then what if you want to hit the amp a little harder without having to change how you want the reverb?
Let's see how this sounds then. So
this should be close-ish to flat. So it's like a less colorful circuit than EUNA. Part of that is down to like the medium input impedance. So I do have a lot of players that are bass players that use this as a preamp.
Right.
So we'll start adding gain. Part of what I always wanted about this was to be able to find that moment, in the Late for the Sky guitar solo, it sounds like a clean tone,
right.
And then he goes up to one note, I can't play it, but having that note where you can actually tune the gain of the pedal, which itself is super clean, to find that spot on the amp, that perfect breakup spot where with your playing, it just speaks where you want it to speak. And then we can dial in a bit of the presence control there. Little bright. Maybe you want to be back here. nothing in the pedal is distorting. It's just hitting the amp. If you wanted to, you know, really. Do you want to play it so you can rip some little? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say
you're better at the solo.
I don't know about that. Here's where we need Pete, but anyway, it's like. So like you say, this is not an overdrive pedal. What we're hearing is what the amp sounds like, just driven much harder.
Yeah, I mean, like if you don't mind a bit of technical description, for those who might not know, most tube amps, you know, a single tube is 2 amplifiers usually, a little 12x7 is 2 amplifier circuits in there. What usually happens, although not in every case, is that the signal comes in and hits the first stage with no attenuation or nothing. Then the volume knob is in between.
Right.
So when you talk about dialing in the amp to get what you're basically doing is dialing in the breakup of the second half of the first tube. But let's say you're playing in your room and you love that, or in a small club or whatever, you love the sound of the tube breakup. You don't want to start getting the breakup here on the pedal board, but you have to dial it back. So you're not hitting what is called V2.
Right. Yeah.
What this is letting you do is hit V1 hard, get that tube distortion, and then duck back the volume before you hit V2.
Yeah. So on the Friedman, so
yeah, and like let's say you thought it was a little bright or something, you could just kind of. Or like maybe you thought it was a little dark.
it does. I mean, it sounds great. But again, wow, that's massive. It's still very touch sensitive. If I, you know. It's a big sound. I mean, it's a cool sounding pedal. Is it fair to say, you know, you're not aiming at the guy who's probably got a, you know, affordable valve amplifier and a couple of affordable valve, you know, I think you're aiming at the guy that's probably invested, guy or girl that's invested probably fairly heavily in their rig and is searching for that final 1 or 2%.
I mean, definitely that's like the clearer use case for the way I design stuff, but more I'm just trying to design things that I would like to have as tools as an engineer, and that as a player, and that I don't see out there already.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I don't do like conventional stuff is not because I don't like the conventional. Like I like that stuff. Don't worry, I have a tube screamer. You know what I mean? I have a big muff. They're great. I have a lot of friends, you know, who make really cool boutique overdrives and things. I have a lot of those. And I think they're all great. And so when I'm trying to find a place for myself in there and for my designs, I'm always trying to think of like, well, what's a different way to do it, or what way hasn't been tried yet. So while, yeah, you're right that it's a good fit for the sort of boutique tone person who's got their rig largely dialed in and is just looking for a little improvement here, a little improvement there. That's a really clear use case. But also a lot of creative players, you know, who maybe don't spend a ton of time auditioning different overdrives, find they like them because they're creatively really flexible, and they're also, part of the design is to try to be creatively neutral. Like, I'm not trying to tell you what sounds good. I think that's an important part of my design ethos. I want to make good sounding circuits that have some creative options without necessarily trying to tell you, like, you know, hey, this is what sounds cool. You know, a lot of pedals that are cool, they do the same thing for everyone. And one thing I try to build into my stuff is that it'll do different things for different players, you know? Part of the reason why, you know, you notice when you back off, it sounds clean, it sounds like you. It sounds like you, it sounds like that guitar, it sounds like that amp. And baking that into the ability to add gain and add a little tonal shaping without necessarily having something like as clearly defined as a big muff that kind of does the same thing for everybody, you know?
Effects loop on the back, presumably for the same reason as on the EUNA, right?
Yeah, so that, like, let's say you didn't have a channel switching amp and you wanted to just do some simple channel switching. You could have a different gain pedal, you could have a different drive pedal. If you had an overdrive that you liked at the end that could drive the amp well, and you wanted to have kind of flip back and forth. Again, swapping rather than just adding, you know?
You mentioned as well, I think off camera, that actually we could use the effects loop on this to run a 4-cable method into an amplifier and flip-flop between the preamp of the amp and the preamp in here as well. That's kind of cool.
Because I really like the sound of a solid-state preamp with a tube power amp, and a lot of amps are...
Music Man stuff, wasn't it?
And a lot of amps are designed to break up earlier than I would like. So... you can use this, it's really similar to other 4-cable method stuff to dial it in. And then also you can swap between the amp's preamp and this, so then you could get channel switching back on a non-channel switching amp.
Cool. Right. So third, the flower, right?
Yeah.
Flower with no vowels. What do you call flower with no vowels? I don't know. Anyway, right. Give us a second. So the flower, a little bit more compact than the first two. And I think if there is a slightly more conventional use case of pedal, this is probably it. This is probably more sitting in the sense of you would like to add some drive to the amplifier chain or the signal chain. Tell me about, you know, so why, you know, you almost kind of before went, I haven't gone into the kind of, you know, haven't done a 29 tube screamer clone or big muff clone or whatever. But so what is this just, you know, end users kind of going, please, please, please make us an overdrive pedal? Yeah,
and also, you know, you do once you get the first few designs out and you're looking around, you're going, you know, I would like to do something in the overdrive realm because I had never found my perfect overdrive, and I think for a lot of players that overdrive exists already on the market, and I'm very jealous that it does because I had to design one. One of my personal pet peeves about a lot of drives is that even at low gain settings, you step on it and you can feel the frequency response kind of drop a little high, drop a little low, and it gets a little murky for me. Again, as a low volume player that usually plays kind of cleaner stuff, I lose a lot in overdrive pedals that maybe a louder player doesn't lose. So I wanted to make something again that when you pull back, it cleans up, and when you push forward, it gets a little dirtier. It's also got some like non-conventional ways of creating gain inside of it. So it just sounds different from other ones, and that was important to me.
Let's see how different it is. So if I kind of play...
Yeah, so I'll start with the off there.
I'm playing intentionally. I'm going to try and go between very soft and dug in a little.
And so this is the lowest gain setting where you'll hear it's adding a tiny little bit of boost, but it's fairly clean down there. As you add gain, the gain control is slightly non-linear, so it warms up a little bit as you add gain.
I'm picking incredibly softly now, but it's still full.
Yeah. And so that's the travel that we just did on the lowest and flattest gain setting. So if you dial the gain back here, the 3, 2, 1 and ABC shape controls, it's so challenging to find an accurate description. Like a circuit designer would know exactly what it is, but it's hard to describe in like terms that don't sound like I'm being intentionally vague. But the way you can think about it is that the numbers are how much gain is available in the circuit, and the letters are how much of that gain you're using. So we're going to click in. So 2 is just a much higher available gain, but we'll stay on B, which is flat-ish.
So the gain now we're hearing, would you say is entirely from the pedal, or are we hitting the amp maybe
we'll
hard
pull
enough?
this back a little bit so we can make sure it's us.
Yeah, I think that sound, there's a little bit more definition, I think, if you take the level down a bit,
Yeah.
so it probably isn't hitting the amp quite so hard. I'm trying to, again, love guitar words to describe things. It is more, what's the right word? I don't want to say it's more transistor sounding, because I think that there is a sort of negative connotation to saying that. But you are getting a crispness at the top end that isn't necessarily reminiscent of a valve compressing heavily and distorting heavily.
It's funny because to me a lot of times, like, you know, it is I couldn't fit tubes in there, so it is transistors in there doing the distorting. And I think a lot of transistor circuits that try to sound tubey, they just end up rolling a lot of the top end off, and I don't know that that's how a tube amp sounds to me. I think of tube amps as airy and bright and clean. And so
that's a good point, you know, because I think you get so sold the idea that you're buying a pedal that's emulating a tube circuit like that. You are, and actually I find when I do, and it's not very often, but when I do use an amp where all the gain is coming from the amplifier, it's a lot brighter than I perhaps think that it should be compared to my pedals that claim to be tubey sounding. And I think sometimes as well, I get very used to the smoothness of an overdrive pedal. And I find the brightness of a driven amplifier sometimes, I was going to say uncomfortable, but that's not the right. As in, I'm sort of going, oh crikey, is it too bright? So it's interesting. Even though I use the word to describe this as maybe a bit more transistor sounding, maybe it's the opposite.
It's a fair description because it is transistors.
As they all are. Let's hear it through the Friedman for a second. You can absolutely hear the front end of that amplifier going almost now, that's a lot for me to take. You know, it's like, it's sort of, you know. It does. Oh, got both on there. That for me that's a good sound. It's an authentic old-fashioned sounding driven tube amp sound,
Yeah.
I think. And actually not that, I don't know, what are we at? Yeah, I was just looking at our decibel meter. We're probably circa 10 dB less than we might typically go for it in here. So we're not crazy loud, you know.
There's another setting on
It's
here.
not what it's, you know what, it's not, I think, you know, you talked about all those conventional pedals. So you think of tube screamers and blues breakers and all kinds of different drive pedals that you might buy, blues drivers. It's got more top end than all of those, hasn't it? It's definitely got.
It's not shaving it off.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because I don't usually like to put in, I mean, I'll say this and then the next thing I'll have it, but I don't like, from an audio engineering standpoint, and I grew up working for a lot of old curmudgeonly audio engineers.
Curmudgeonly?
Yeah.
Great word, straight out the Oxford English Dictionary. Congratulations, the first American person I've ever heard use that word. That's perfect.
It's an honor.
Curmudgeonly. There you go, everyone. Use that today.
You know, if you can get the sound you want with no EQ, it will sound better than having EQ when all other things are equal. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of pedals, the EQ is always sitting there. It's not like on a console where you can switch the EQ out, right? If you're sitting at your console and the EQ is flat, you can switch it out, and cumulatively, it will be a little lower noise, it'll be a little faster circuit, you'll get a little better transient response. I mean, again, minor differences. Like, I appreciate fully that I am a person who traffics in subtleties, you know? And I receive that criticism sometimes, and I'm happy about it. But this just doesn't clamp it down.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of pedals, I think, would clamp it down and then add an EQ so you could make it bright again. And that to me is like, I wanted to do something a little different where it just doesn't clip it off.
Awesome.
Although there is a setting that does.
Ooh.
If you click down here, this is like a heavily heavily low pass filter on the second gain stage. So you can almost get this up into fuzz territory.
Well, let's give that a go. It's quite muffled. Can I try it with the Les Paul?
Yeah.
It's not as gainy as maybe a big muff would be or something like that, but it's
like a big muff on low.
Yes. It's got that sag thing that a fuzz does, where it goes wah and then comes in again.
Yeah.
Again, maybe that's the sort of thing that maybe only the player feels rather than anyone hears.
Yeah.
I like it.
If you put them like in the opposite setting, you can find something a little in between. Like, this is the brighter of these and the darker of these.
It's edging now from a low gain fuzz to a more conventional drive type sound and feel as well.
The low setting also is really fun. One of the design impetuses for this, like one of the things on the board, I wish it could do this, and it's hard to say if I did it, but I have a friend in LA, Chris Vincent, whose pedals are called R2R, and he makes, to me, the best new old stock Rangemaster you can get.
Right.
If I was going to build old stuff, I would build it exactly like Chris. He's super cool. He sits there, he matches pots and matches transistors and stuff. And we were lamenting one day that the Rangemaster thing, like, is so dependent on hitting the amp, right?
Yeah.
If you want that thing, you kind of have to go guitar, Rangemaster, amp, 10, and that's how you do it. And as soon as you have a Rangemaster and you're trying to hit anything else on your board,
right,
it's like, oh, it doesn't do the thing. So I wanted to make something that could do the thing.
Right.
And I will leave it up to players to decide if it does it. But if you set it about like that, it'll let's say, to be safe, it'll almost do the thing. So if you have your range master into this, then you can hold that sound on your hand and plug it into a reverb pedal, plug it into a phaser.
I see. It's that early old. I'm thinking of a players infinitely better than I am, but when you talk about the Claptons and the Kossoffs and all that kind of stuff that could just plug into a valve amplifier with an old, something like an old fuzz, but really going like, I'm going to destroy this amplifier.
Yeah.
And then the note does that thing and it kind of sings and all
that. Yeah,
that.
like if we find a spot, so now if you notice, we still have a ton of gain left, or a ton, we're using all the gain, but we have a ton of level. So if we start letting this hit the amp part.
Yes, sir. I mean,
that's awesome.
We're still not crazy loud. We're still not crazy loud, and and again, actually,
we're on the deluxe.
The 100 watt clean thing is maybe, what does it do on the, this may be the wrong amp to try and do this with, but this is more reminiscent of an old Marshall, Literally, no dry run, no, just first note, Les Paul, that pedal, that amplifier, full Nigel Tufnell mode. Wow! Oh, well, there we go. That was cool. Again, I almost feel like I want to play it more. The bed!
And it's not even that loud.
It's not even that loud.
Can you imagine the sustain if we turned it all the way up?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't own a good Les Paul, I'm sure there are other guitars that will do something similar, but it's almost a cliche that you get that guitar, that style of pedal into that style of amplifier, and all of a sudden there it is.
Yeah,
it's like you can make the magic happen.
Yeah.
Oh, I liked that bit. You see, the soup. That's. I've kind of surprised myself a bit there. So, right, enough of the flower.
Oh yeah.
We're gonna. This is a work in progress, right? So you can't buy this yet. Maybe if you're watching this video a few months after it came out, maybe you will. But what are you? Let's plug this in, and then you can tell me about it.
Great.
Working title: the JFET.
Yeah.
What are we? What are you trying to achieve here?
So some of my favorite pedals before I was a builder were like the simple JFET boost that you can buy. It comes by a lot of names. Some people call it an Echoplex style circuit. Some people know it as the Tillman boost, which is one of the oldest style DIY circuits. A notable manufacturer just released a similar thing that's just a single JFET in a box. And I wanted to see if I could get that sound that I loved out of those things, but maybe a little more versatile and find something a little more interesting. Again, just sort of do my thing. It's got the whatever power input, and it's got bipolar voltage rails, so it it sings a little differently, and you can have fewer components when you do bipolar voltage rails, which in a hi-fi sense will make it sound better. But it's got this fun little toggle in it, and N is like for normal, which is basically like more or less what I think it might sound like in a more conventional setting. Then F is full, which adds a little bit more bottom end. And then X is like a little X mode where it kind of, it's just the full version that I want it to do, where it's like, I want this circuit to be able to perform its best. Mm-hmm. So it's a little more component intensive than a single JFET, but it's kind of based around my love of that sound. It's got a sort of medium high input impedance. So for a player that maybe doesn't require the loop of EUNA and isn't necessarily interested in something that squeaky clean, this has a little bit of hair on it, although it's not a lot. But also the way I built the pedal, a lot of those pedals, as you turn them up, you're like, I'm adding clean gain to my amp, and what you find is you've actually run out of headroom on the pedal, and the pedal is distorting. Yeah. So this is sort of the opposite, where the bit of hair on the circuit is kind of fixed, and this ends up just being a level control to get more or less out of it, but it'll be as clean as it is down here when it's up here.
I've owned EP boosts and stuff like that, and I've ended up tending to use them as this sort of, this always on type thing, rather than as an actual on-off boost. I think sometimes because on that particular pedal, or it adds in too much bass end for me to ever feel like you can then turn it off. It almost has to be the pedal that you always have on to just fatten your whole thing. And then you almost might put a pedal over the top of that to maybe tighten it up for a gainy kind of sound.
That's why it's sort of, I use mine after EUNA, and I use it as an on-off kind of thing.
So you use it as an on-off.
But for players that use that kind of thing as an always-on, like this may find a permanent home on your board, whereas if you may not require the loop and stuff.
So let's hear without it. It's our clean sound. Again, it's one of those pedals. All your pedals seem to have that. Probably the easiest way to sum up, maybe not the flower, but the other. It's just like if you've got an amplifier that sounds almost as good as you'd like it to sound. And you just put one of these pedals in, it just kind of makes it sound a bit better. Without necessarily changing the whole characteristic of the amplifier.
You think about the way you work in a studio, right? You patch in a piece of gear and you click it in and out, and if it doesn't immediately sound a little bit better, you just click it off and pull it out of the chain.
Right.
And you're always trying to find the least amount of stuff that can get the best sound you can get that day.
I tell you what, again, I'm feeling here is there's a feel thing. There's I don't know that I've ever really consciously felt lag in my guitar playing, other than when I'm perhaps playing through you're going through an interface or going through a digital processor, and then there is that slight feeling. But even though I'm not conscious of feeling lag without the pedal, I feel somehow like there's less lag with the pedal.
It's faster,
It's faster, It's really odd, actually. It's almost difficult. You have to experience it to even know that there was something there when it wasn't on. bad. Let's try the other amp
Yeah.
as well. It's so weird. It's like, sometimes I think pedals are bad because you take an amplifier that you're perfectly happy with, you hear it with a pedal and go, I like that more, and then you turn the pedal off and you go, I don't like my amp anymore. It's like, if that, I don't know if I've worded that in a, but I tell you what, man, this sense of it being faster, I'm not sure I've ever really appreciated that before. Maybe it has been happening with other drive pedals or other pedals and I've just not really consciously felt it. Maybe I needed someone like you to say maybe it's happening and then my brain goes, oh yeah. But it is 100% tangible. It's here. Again, you won't be able to hear it, but...
This is my favorite part, is always like watching somebody enjoy it and like listening to somebody play when they're having a fun time playing. You know, from being like on the other side of the glass so much, you can tell when people are, you know, doing their best. You can tell when people are genuinely enjoying themselves. And like, to me, that's always the magic you're looking for, rather than like, I mean, this is going to sound corny, but like, rather than chasing tone, I feel like I'm always trying to chase a moment. You know, like a moment where you're connecting with your instrument, and you're connecting with the choices of what you're playing, and you're connecting with the people you're playing with, and there are those moments, right, where the studio's hot and everything is working, and it can be when you're by yourself in your own little small studio, or it can be like when you're in a big studio with a bunch of musicians. But there are those moments, right, and that's when everything is working for you. And so to me, it's like whatever gear it takes to get you there. Sometimes I meet people and they're like, oh, I'm just a guitar and amp guy. And I'm like, you know, I'm so jealous. Because if that gets you there, it's a relatively simple formula. And I end up, you know, building other things. And I build stuff like this because this gets me closer to that. And, you know, I think part of the reason that I focus on the feel of the circuit, even though it's a hard thing to quantify, it's really hard to measure, but I have been able to measure parts of it, is like that's what gets me there, you know. I always tell people, like, I have a really fragile creative process. You know, I hear a weird noise, or I feel the circuit getting too pushy or resistive for me, and all of a sudden I have no cool ideas, you know.
Chasing the moment. What a great way of describing it, because I kind of feel it's the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? You can't. I don't necessarily feel like, you know, you've got to have a rig that you're fundamentally pretty happy with and comfortable with.
Yeah.
And then you add in one of these in just to put, you know, I don't. You could almost say the Tube Screamer's the opposite end of the scale. It's almost like if you've got a rig that you're fundamentally not happy with, and that you could put a Tube Screamer and you kind of go, it's going to get me roughly in the zone, and away I go. So, I mean, it's really, really cool, man. I wanted to sort of end this little interview by saying, you know, thank you very much for coming in, showing us your toys, and hopefully you guys have enjoyed this. But it does take me to... Pete and I were lucky enough to go and spend the day at the That Pedal Show studios the other day. And we've known Mick and Dan for a long time, and we're very, very close. And they won't mind me saying that, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, I watched some of their videos and the whole #BecauseTone, and I'm all a bit like, you know, come on, man. You know, how much of this is just, you know, like, it's all in the brain. And we went down there, and both Pete and I, it's like, they set us up with epic gear and epic power supplies and all the right cables and great guitars and all their favorite pedals and stuff. And you realize that actually, I don't know what my analogy is going to be, but you know, you realize that you can fly so high with all of the normal gear, But then there is another layer of atmosphere that you can break into.
Yeah. There is. Yeah.
It's you're getting high, right? You know, you're not talking about, but it does a thing. It's a moment.
It does,
I think it's like you say, it's a moment rather than a sound almost. You know?
And what I think is really interesting about it that I think gets lost in the debate about it is that, like, you know, you go to a place like that and you plug into a great amplifier with a great guitar and great cabling and all that stuff, and you can feel there is a difference, right? There's something magical about it. There's something, you know, because I watch all their videos as well. I'm like a fan of the channel, and so it's like, yeah, I always love the way they do it, and I think that, like, you know, how much of that you need to pull into your own rig is like a really personal choice, and so I think when people want to say, like, does great gear matter? Like, what matters, what doesn't matter? I just never think it's that simple. I mean, perhaps you're a person who's like, you know, my dream guitar is a 50s Les Paul, and I know that they're insanely expensive, but it's my dream guitar, and it's going to shorten the distance between me and my ideas, you know? And so I'll spend all the money on the guitar, and I'll feel great playing it. And then maybe you say, like, you know, I don't actually care what amp I play. I have this, I have that. They're all fine. I think like finding what matters to you, like finding what matters to you personally is the journey. And sometimes it will be something esoteric and vintage or expensive or whatever. And sometimes it'll be relatively normal. And like, I think that, like, you know, one of the things that I think is funny is I don't think people really exist that actually say, oh, you have to have this or you have to have that. It's like a fictional type of person that we've invented. Because, I mean, I used to work for a guy that bought and sold vintage guitars, and I would go into his office and he'd have 4 or 5 60s Strats and, you know, 4 or 5 early 60s Les Pauls. And he'd say, oh, that's a good one. I might keep that one. That one's not as good, you know. Every now and then you find a 50s Les Paul that doesn't sound very good. And, you know, and maybe that's the one that someone A-B'd against some other one. They go, aha. You know, I'm always very suspicious of the aha moment because it can only really be true in context. So, like, what matters for one person may not matter for another people. I think it's why I think it's so cool that there's so many different types of tools. Yeah. You know, if a person can walk into a store and buy a DS1 and be thrilled with that pedal, I think that's great.
Oh, and you know, in the great, you know, mystery that is music, you know, all the best songs were written by musicians that did not have all the best gear at that time. So you know, this is very this is quite a you know, it's quite a gratuitous journey, isn't it, of just sort of self-fulfillment. But hey, it's what we all love, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, look, Jesse, it's been a pleasure to have you in the studio.
Thanks so much.
Lovely to meet you. Hope you enjoyed the rest of your stay in the UK.
I will. Already enjoying it.
Thank you guys for watching. I'll put some links below to where you can find out more about 29 pedals. They are, of course, all for sale from Andertons. If you would care to purchase one, we'll ship it to you pretty much wherever you live in the world. But yes, thank you so much for coming in. It's been an education.
You're too kind. It's wonderful to be here.
Great. See you next time, everyone.